all, and welcome back to There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani, and today I'm going to bring another episode of a prison history and even a little bit of scandal. So, let's get into it, shall we? The Oregon State Penitentiary is a landmark within the middle of the capital of Oregon. The looming structure of concrete and iron is truly a sight to behold. Historical gates remain as a testament to what the structure was compared to what it has become. The old houses of former guards that used to live on the grounds they work on now stand empty or have been altered to be useful in some other way. The water fountain long since been replaced with a parking lot. From its creation, the walls have gone from short and wooden to towering concrete that contain sensors to detect touch on the inside. But the age is evident. The catwalk in which the guards still walk has splits, signs of decay that require one walking to watch their step as much as they watch those within the walls. The fact that it's in the middle of town, surrounded by homes and businesses, is an anomaly. But it didn't always start in town. The town simply grew into and around it. The site of Oregon State Penitentiary has changed drastically over the years. First designed by G.W. Rhodes and excavated by prisoners. It all began with a temporary wooden building being erected on the outskirts of Salem, in which prisoners from Portland were transported to starting in May 16th of 1866. The building began as a 90-foot by 36-foot with 9-foot by 3-foot windows covered by iron gratings. The cell block was in the center of the building and was 2 tiers high, containing 40 cells. Immediately, escapes plagued the location. On August 27, 1866, approximately 50 men attempted to escape by walking or climbing over the temporary stockade wall, also made of wood at this time. On August 1st, 1872, a building known as Cell Block A was built. It was 212 feet by 45 feet. Iron bars ran across each cell and was powered electrically through hydropower, using the creek that ran through the center of the prison yard. The prison itself was octagonal and had 3 radiating wings. The center wing was the administrative offices, the chapel, and the kitchen. The other 2 wings were of opposite sides. In 1882, a north wing, Cell Block B, with an additional 24 double cells and 32 single cells, was built. The foundation was concrete, with 3 tiers of iron cells, and was 80 feet by 40 feet, as well as 40 feet tall. The outer grating around it were brick cells. Individual cells were 9 feet by 5 feet and housed 2 men. It housed a faucet for drinking, as well as a urinal and night bucket that was dumped into Mill Creek each morning. A 3-inch hole was located at the back of each cell to vent the airspace between the walls and provide fresh air. Often, this little hole ended up plugged. In 1885, the north wing was extended 75 feet. In 1887, an iron fence was installed across the front of the prison. A 2-story laundry building and workshops were also added at this time. In 1892, OSP was averaging between 324 and 421 inmates and began photographing incoming prisoners. Death ran rampant, often caused by malaria fever and consumption at this time. In 1907, OSP brought in the striped uniforms first created at the Auburn Prison in New York. The inmates had their heads shaved, received floggings, and were chained to their cell doors, often being hosed with water. They were not allowed to talk to each other in the dining room and marched single file when moving throughout the prison. If the inmates were violent, they were forced to walk in the quote-unquote bull ring, a circle painted in an isolated yard and monitored by guards carrying leather saps or truncheons. Later in the year, they were allowed to wear cadet gray prison suits. Stripes were then used as punishment. In order to create income and keep the men working, the men began working at various industries, including brick making, the industry, a stove foundry, a harness factory, and a farm that fed the prison. In 1910, electric lights were mounted into the cells. In 1913, a telephone system was installed. The same year, guards' quarters were constructed from one of the old barns on site. In 1922, a greenhouse was built on the outer perimeter of the prison. The prison was created to hold up to 594 inmates, and by 1929, the population exceeded 710. So, construction continued. That same year, 100 double concrete toilets and sewer lines were dug out. In 1932, cell block C was built that included a bullpen or punishment cells, and this increased the capacity by 1,000. In 1949, cell block D was added, along with a new 25-foot-high concrete perimeter that increased the size within the prison to 22 acres. The wall also extended 4 to 12 feet below the ground. It also had walkways, guard towers, and 2 main entrances with sally ports. In 1953, cell block A was demolished and an intermediate building was opened that contained the support facilities for the prison, including a chapel, hospital, barbershop, library, etc. The same year, a segregation building that could hold 90 inmates as well as an execution chamber. The segregation building followed a prison riot that burnt multiple areas of the prison, including the loss of an entire cell block, and the notorious octagonal structure in the center of the blocks. In 1956, Mill Creek was diverted so that the river now runs outside of the prison walls instead of through it. In 1957, the original cell block A was finished, being replaced with a new building for minimum security inmates specifically. As of today, the penitentiary has 4 cell blocks, 2 dormitories that are currently shut down, a segregation unit, a building housing the behavioral health unit and mental health infirmary. It also has vocational training shops, a physical plant with 10 shops, an education department, a library, an infirmary, a kitchen, dining room, and recreation areas. The prison has a call center, and one of the plants is a laundry unit, completing laundry care for various businesses, including Salem Health Memorial. Outside the old death row building, there are individual cells built on concrete for segregated workout areas. The prison yard is massive, boasting multiple weight pits, a putt-putt golf course, a baseball field next to a bank of telephone booths. There's also an indoor building used for yard time and a basketball court. The intermediate building continues to house various accessories, such as the infirmary and a dental office. There used to be a recording studio, but it was dismantled after the evisceration of an inmate in the soundproof recording area. Now that I've talked a little bit about this behemoth of a place and how it was built and changed, let's talk more about what happened there. Like I said earlier, as soon as it opened, inmates were all about escaping. One of the first wardens believed in reform, and on August 31st, 1866, removed the prisoner's shackles and was immediately attacked by 9 prisoners who disarmed him and ran off into the woods. Oregon then invented the Oregon boot, or Gardner shackle, to prevent escapes. This was an iron or lead band that locked around the prisoner's ankle and weighed about 40 pounds. It was then welded to a heavy iron support strap. It was patented by Warden J.C. Gardner, and for a time it was sold to prisons throughout the U.S. In 1875, a fire occurred, though I can't find much about the resulting damage. On July 3rd, 1883, a violent riot occurred, and a guard shot and killed 4 of the participating inmates. On June 9th, 1902, Harry Tracy and David Merrill escaped. Harry Tracy was born in Wisconsin, served time in the Utah State Penitentiary, and was 24 years old at this time. David Merrill was born in Washington and had been in the Oregon State Penitentiary and was 28. They were sentenced to 20 years and 13 years respectively for assault and robbery. When the duo first arrived to OSP on March 22, 1899, and from there they started to cause issues. They were required to wear the Oregon boot and be watched. On June 8th, a former inmate, Charles Monte, scaled the prison walls and placed the guns and ammunition in the molding room for the pair. The morning of the 9th, Harry and David entered the molding room, where they were retrieved by Harry. Immediately, they shot a guard, Frank Farrell, and the duo went to the window and shot at the guards in post number 1, then ran through the front shops and killed guards SRT Jones and BF Tiffany. An inmate, Frank Ingram, attempted to stop and disarm them, but was shot in the leg during the struggle. He went on to have his leg amputated and then pardoned. The duo headed north from there to Portland and Seattle. They left a trail of evidence as they went, walking into houses with their guns and demanding food. On June 16th, the duo held up 3 men on the south bank of the Columbia in Portland, forcing the men to ferry them to Washington. In Vancouver, they held up another farmer and took his clothes. On June 17th at midnight, 2 deputy sheriffs got into a firefight with the pair, in which a bullet went through the coat of one of the deputy sheriffs. On June 18th, they were spotted at Le Center. The next day, they went to a farmhouse 3 miles away, demanding food. In June, Harry shot David in the back and hid his body. It was located on July 15th by a Chehalis woman and her son picking blackberries. David's body was returned to OSP, where many of the inmates actually believed the remains to be that of a different man, known as quote-unquote Bunky Kelly. Following his trail was Deputy Sheriff Charles Raymond and a posse of 40 men. On July 3rd, Harry was alone near Lake Washington and forced people to serve him, telling them he killed David and left him near Chehalis. The same day, he ran into a posse including Deputy Sheriff Raymond Bauer and Williams, along with Carl Anderson and Louis B. Seffrit. Harry killed all the deputy sheriffs, at which point the governor called out the National Guard. But Harry forced a man to ferry him from Port Madison. On Bainbridge Island, he kidnapped John Anderson, a farmhand, and took him hostage for weeks. On July 9th, a report that Harry and David were at Orolio came through, though David had been shot, supposedly, and dead by this time. The next day, John was forced to buy a revolver and ammunition. On July 11th, Harry got into another gunfight, at which time hounds picked up his trail. On July 15th, Harry was found again, and again got away. On July 23rd, Harry was in Palmer, reported to be in a restaurant eating breakfast. On August 1st, C.V. Drayson, a farmer near Odessa, Washington, came home to a note on his door. It read, quote, "To whom it may concern, tell Mr. Cuddy to take a tumble and let me alone, or I will fix him plenty. I will be on my way to Wyoming. If your horses are good, would swap with you. Thanks for a cool drink." End quote. The next day, he got into a firefight with Under Sheriff Gardner and his posse. He was shot in the right leg and subsequently shot himself 20 minutes after being wounded. Found at dawn with a revolver in his right hand. Now let's get back to OSP. On May 4th, 1909, the foundry and stove manufacturing building caught fire. On December 11th, 1911, Fred Weaver escaped after breaking out of a bakery. Fred arrived in OSP in May with a sentence of 5 to 15 years for burglary. Fred usually started his day at 4 a.m. and so was always in bed by 7. The day of the escape, he made a fake body and put it in his bed and went back to the bakery early in the night. He hid behind a stack of flour barrels, and when they cleared the kitchen at night, they missed him. Then Fred waited to make sure count cleared, and his dummy ruse worked. After that, he saw the bars in the bakery and crawled into the yard, then saw the bars to get into the basement. There he broke a lock on a door and threw another set of bars. He waited for the yard guard to make his rounds, and then walked to a stairway leading to a vacated guard tower. He walked through the tower and out the runway, then dropped onto the ground. He was captured in Seattle a few months later. On October 23, 1914, Karl Weinegal and Frank Wagner made an improvised drill with a heavy steel spike and dug through brick walls and a concrete floor. But guard J.H. Evans caught them, fired a warning shot, and the two ceased their efforts to escape. On September 27, 1915, another inmate escaped and murdered the current warden, Harry Minto. 21-year-old Otto Hooker escaped killing the warden as he was pursued. 200 men with bloodhounds tracked him down, and he was shot and killed the next day in Albany, Oregon. On May 18, 1916, Jeff Baldwin, a.k.a. Charlie Panzram, set fire to a flax plant, resulting in damage to that building, the steam plant, and the shoe shop. On June 10, 1916, Charles Droker crawled under a truck and escaped as the truck drove out of the prison. Charles was sentenced in May 1915 with 10 years in prison. Before his escape, he was quiet, only speaking with one other inmate, Frank Wagner, though the words were minimal and infrequent. On the day of the escape, he failed to show for noon count. The search for him began immediately within the prison, but nothing was found. For 2 days they searched before hearing that he crawled under a truck and just simply rode out. He was never captured. On September 29, 1916, William Tanner was believed to have escaped, but 10 days later, he was found when he and his girlfriend Hazel Irwin attacked Carrie Kirsch in the women's quarters of the prison. Carrie called for help, and Williams was found hiding on the top of a bookcase. On February 3, 1917, Karl Weinegal, again along with Lothar F. von Falkenthal and Julius Kyle, attempted to escape, but were captured by the trustees they were working with. On May 12, 1918, Jefferson Baldwin, again later known as Charlie Panzram, escaped for the second time. Again, the first was on September 18, 1917. On March 22, 1922, James Ogle was purportedly going to attempt to escape. He was brought into the bullpen for exercise when he picked up a rock and barely missed guard John Davidson. In response, Davidson shot and killed him. On November 21, 1925, Frank Fallon was going to have a gun brought to him and escape. The man attempting to smuggle the gun, however, was caught. On July 15, 1952, Harold Hayes and Franklin Klingenpeel crawled through a sewer pipe in an attempt to escape. Harold made it 350 feet before dying from the inhalation of sewer gas. Franklin subsequently called out for help and was rescued. On September 13, 1952, Gerald Maycomer and Charles Crozier hid under loose boards of a sawdust truck and escaped. In April 1953, 5 inmates hid in the false bottom of a flax wagon, but were caught. On July 11, 1953, inmates refused to go to work. They rioted and set a fire, causing damage. Riots also occurred in 1926, 1936, and 1968, all causing severe damage. In 1962, the prison was damaged during a storm, and then again during a flood in 1964. Then a fire the same year. On March 9, 1968, one of the largest riots occurred, starting at 4:10 p.m. Inmates began rioting as they returned from yard, heading towards their cells. 700 inmates were involved. 22 guards were held hostage. 6 of them were injured. 4 of them were held for over 16 hours. 1 inmate was killed and many others were injured. 13 civilians had to be rescued. In the end, approximately $5 million in damage resulted from this. Fires were started in the rehabilitation facilities, the industrial plant, the kitchen, dining room, and more than half the cells. The offices of the chaplain, sociologists, and counselors were demolished. The hospital was also damaged. Once the riot was controlled, it was determined that 4 inmates and 25 conspirators planned to start the riot. In 1997, June 12, 1997, a 24-foot-long tunnel was discovered. It was under a table in a loading dock and had a 13-foot by 18-foot entrance. 10 inches of concrete had been carved out, and the tunnel ended 120 feet short of the southern prison wall. It was found by a kitchen supervisor, and during the investigation, 7 inmates were identified in the plan. Now let's change subjects to punishments. One of the punishments that occurred, as mentioned, was being hosed. That meant that an inmate was stripped from the waist up and handcuffed to a wall so that his arms were stretched out. The inmate was sprayed with high-velocity water until their skin turned blue from bruising. Inmates would also be tied by the wrists to the bars of their cells with their arms above their head, left hanging for up to 8 hours. And now, let's go to the executions. Because, as we should all know by now, Oregon has the death penalty. While it's on a moratorium, it wasn't always. Between 1904 and 1931, 42 men were hanged at OSP. The first man was Harry Egbert on January 29, 1904, the youngest of which was 19-year-old Frank Seymour. On December 19, 1912, 4 men were hanged on the same day. The last man to suffer a hanging was James Kingsley. In 1936, the use of the gas chamber was voted by the Oregon legislature. Then, in 1938, a gas chamber was installed, and between June 1939 and August 1962, 18 men were put to death through gas. The first of which was Leroy McCarthy on June 20th, 1939. The youngest was 17-year-old John Soto on March 20th, 1942, and on January 9th, 1953, a double execution was completed of Frank Payne and Morris Leland. On June 2nd, 1969, the gas chamber was pulled and cut up for scrap when the state repealed capital punishment. Voters then reinstated capital punishment in November of 1978. Lethal injection was approved April 1979. On September 6, 1996, Douglas Wright was put to death by lethal injection, followed by Harry Moore on May 16, 1997. And now let's move into a bit of recent history. The penitentiary created a hospice program in 1999. It is staffed by volunteer inmates who sit with those that are considered imminent or near imminent to death. In 2001, the hospice program won, quote, Program of the Year, end quote, from the National Commission on Correction Care. In May 2020, it was announced that death row was to be ended. On December 13, 2022, the governor commuted the death sentences of everyone on Oregon's death row to life without parole. Additionally, she ordered the multipurpose room, the room in which death sentences were supposed to be carried out, to be taken apart. Really, all that room was a table, EKG, and a few other items, so I'm sure that part was quite easy. And now, let's talk about the biggest, almost unheard of controversy that surrounds the penitentiary. The murder of Mike Francke, the director of Oregon's Department of Corrections at the time. He was stabbed to death in January of 1989. The 6'4" Mike entered law school in New Mexico, taking a full ride as a football player. After which, he worked for the Attorney General, in which he ran a drug interdiction program interacting with all the surrounding states and Mexico. In 1984, a massive riot occurred in a prison in New Mexico, and once prison control was regained, Mike entered the prison seeing the horrifying conditions. He worked to fix the problems of the system, ease overcrowding, and return prisoner education programs. In 1987, Mike was hired as the director of the Oregon Department of Corrections. Corruption and overcrowding were plaguing the system in the state. The year before, the governor opened an investigation into specific corruption allegations. A couple low-ranking guards were fired at this time, but nothing else came of it. At the same time, inmates were being let out for a week or so that others could use their bunks. And then they were swapped out. And yes, this was in the 80s. Drugs, of course, came in easily and readily. According to Murder in Oregon, who does an entire season on this case, corrections at this time were made up of family members. There was a lot of nepotism going on. Shortly before Mike was murdered, he began acting more and more suspicious. He kept a .45 caliber pistol under his pillow, along with a 12-gauge shotgun, riot gun to be specific, leaned against the door. The deck behind his house had hundreds of spent 12-gauge shotgun shells. On January 17th, 1989, at 6:45 p.m., the night before he was going to address the legislative committee on the corruption in his department, he was stabbed to death in the parking lot in the front building where he worked. Mike had walked out of the Dome building, which is the headquarters of the Oregon Department of Corrections, and 40 minutes later his car was found with the driver's side opened by a coworker. She alerted security, who drove around, and after 4 hours, he was found outside the north entrance. He had been stabbed in the heart. Surrounding him was glass from the door he punched out trying to get back in the building. He was approximately 30 feet from his car. He had been missed multiple times during searches of the area. While his watch and wallet were still on him, his briefcase and computer were missing. All of the information on the corruption case he was working on had been taken. One of the janitors potentially saw him. He reported hearing a loud noise at the time of the incident, and then he saw 2 large men. One took off as the janitor saw them, and the other man walked back towards the Dome building. A third suspicious character was seen in the Dome building after it was closed to public for the evening. He was known as an olive-skinned man in a pinstripe suit. The next day, a Saturday, an inmate reports that he was taken to the Dome building and had to shred over 23 bags of papers. And now inmates don't normally work on the weekends in the Dome building. Months later, John Krause is arrested for a parole violation. Upon his arrest, he confesses to the murder of Michael Francke, including information on where he was stabbed and the direction in which he ran after, matching the janitor's story. He told the detectives where he stashed bloody clothing and the knife he used to kill Michael, but police did not follow up at this time, that he stashed it at Buck Burgess's place, a known pedophile. After the confession, John Krause recanted, and the police simply dropped all the charges and him as a suspect. He was even given immunity for it. Another man, the man in the pinstripe suit, was thought to be a man named Tim Natividad, or Rooster. Tim was an abusive schizophrenic that was exacerbated by drug use. His then-girlfriend Liz stated that he claimed to have killed a man around the same time Michael Francke was murdered. Shortly after, Tim threatened to kill Liz and their son, along with her sister and her husband. Liz managed to get a hold of Tim's gun and ended up shooting and killing him. Later, when Liz saw the photograph of the man in the pinstripe suit, she believed it was Tim, taking the information to police, who stated, quote, "You can't convict a dead man," end quote, and laughed at her. Michael's brothers fought to get information to help solve the case. First, they had to get the autopsy report. After months, the first copy they received was about 80% redacted, which is illegal, according to the Brady Act, the act that gives family the right to full autopsy reports. It wasn't until they sued the state of Oregon, the governor, and the DA that they finally received a full copy, but they were threatened with a lawsuit if they released the information. In addition, the sketch of the man in the pinstripe suit didn't make it into the news. Not until Michael's brothers pushed the issue. 8 months later, Frank Gable became a suspect. A jailhouse informant stated that Frank told him that Frank had killed Michael during a car robbery. The jailhouse informant later reported that he made the whole thing up. Frank also had an alibi for the night of the event. And Frank thought that he was an outsider in a drug ring that was picked to be the fall guy. Jody and Shorty, two drug addicts, were coerced by the police to create the story that Frank Gable was guilty. It took them 23 polygraphs to get the story correct. The account that Jody was there and saw Frank Gable stab Michael. Shorty drove up to pick up Jody and also became a witness. This, however, is in direct contradiction with the witnesses that came forward the night of the murder at the Dome building. Still, it ended up going to trial. The defense for Frank Gable was almost laughable if it wasn't for the fact that it was affecting Frank's life. The main defense attorney was purportedly drunk, and they weren't prepared at all. The prosecution had no actual evidence. They had coerced and ever-changing statements from witnesses that were known to police. The lack of a case was palpable and abhorrent, yet the defense did such a horrendous job that in the end, in 1991, Frank Gable was unanimously convicted of the murder of Michael Francke. He narrowly missed the death sentence and attended to the decision. Instead, he received life. But he had defenders in his corner. Michael Francke's brothers and a reporter wouldn't let the murder out of the news, and the fact that Frank Gable was likely a patsy. For 29 years, in fact, the fight was on. Finally, K2 News reported, quote, in 2019, a federal judge found key evidence proving Gable's innocence was kept away from the jury during the 1991 trial. 2 months later, Gable was released from prison, end quote. It took until March of 2025 for Frank to be awarded almost $2 million in compensation. According to Coin News, Oregon AG Dan Rayfield said in part, quote, expediting the process for those who have been exonerated is not just about fairness. It's about correcting wrongs, restoring dignity, and rebuilding trust in our justice system, end quote. Regarding the money awarding for his wrongful conviction. Now, after 36 years, Michael Francke's murder once again is considered an unsolved case. For more in-depth information in the case of Michael Francke, listen to the podcast Murder in Oregon, Who Killed Michael Francke? It is a great resource of information that I clearly just barely glossed over. It also includes information on corruption within the penitentiary, the state police, and the then governor. And with that, that is the history of the Oregon State Penitentiary and the corruption that surrounds it. To all those out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.